There are sounds you expect when you sign up to live on a rock 10 miles out into the Atlantic. You expect the relentless rhythmic thud of the swell hitting the granite foundation. A sound like the Earth's own heartbeat. You expect the wind, which out here doesn't blow so much as it screams, whistling through the iron railings of the gallery deck, like a choir of flutes played by madmen. You expect the foghorn, that mournful bovine lowing that vibrates your fillings every 60 seconds when the gray wall rolls in. But you don't expect the scratching. It was my 3rd week on needlepoint. The novelty of the isolation had worn off, replaced by the damp, heavy reality of the job. My world had shrunk to a vertical cylinder of whitewashed brick and cast iron, surrounded by an infinite churning expanse of gray water. I was asleep in the keeper's quarters, a small circular room halfway up the tower. The storm shutters were bolted tight, but the dampness still found a way in. It seeped into the mattress, into my clothes, into my bones. It smelled of salt and ancient, drying kelp. I woke up at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't the wind that woke me. The wind had died down to a sullen breeze. The ocean was surprisingly calm, the waves slapping lazily against the rocks below. It was a sound coming from the outside of the tower. A pause. It sounded wet, heavy, like a dragging weight being pulled up the rough masonry. It was the sound of a fingernail scraping a chalkboard, but amplified, deeper, resonant. I lay frozen in my bunk, staring at the curved ceiling. I counted the rhythm. Scratch. The sound of something sharp finding purchase in the stone. Thud. The sound of a heavy, wet body hauling itself up. It was climbing. Needlepoint Light is 110 feet tall. My quarters are at the 60-foot mark. Below me is the storage level, the oil room, and the entrance. Above me is the service room and the lantern room itself. The sound was coming from below. Maybe 20 feet down. I told myself it was a bird. A massive seagull or a cormorant that had lost its way and crashed into the tower. But birds don't drag. Birds don't sound wet. Maybe a seal. Seals can climb rocks. But a vertical brick tower, 60 feet above the waterline, Scarich, it was louder now. Closer I rolled out of bed, the floorboards cold against my bare feet. I grabbed the heavy brass flashlight from the nightstand. I crept to the window, a thick porthole of reinforced glass. I didn't want to open the shutter. The iron latch was rusted, and opening it would make a screech that would announce my presence to whatever was out there. So I waited. I pressed my ear against the cold iron of the shutter. Scritch. It was right outside the window now. I held my breath. I could hear something else over the scratching, a breathing sound, not the rhythmic inhalation of a mammal. It was a gurgling, sputtering noise, like water being forced through a clogged drain. Hitch, glug. The dragging stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then, a soft, wet slap hit the shutter. It sounded like a slab of raw liver being thrown against the wall. I recoiled, stumbling back against my bunk. The slap came again. Then a slow, deliberate sliding sound as something rubbed against the metal. It was testing the shutter, feeling the bolts. I gripped the flashlight like a club. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. After what felt like an hour, the sound changed. It moved upward, scritch, thud. It was continuing its ascent. It wasn't interested in me. Not yet. It was heading for the light. I listened until the scraping faded into the wind noise above. I sat on the edge of my bed until dawn, shivering, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. When I checked the calendar in the morning light, I realized the pattern. I had heard a faint scratching 3 nights ago. I had dismissed it as the settling of the old building, but tonight it was undeniable. Every 3rd night it climbs. When the sun finally broke through the morning mist, painting the Atlantic in deceptively cheerful shades of gold and blue, I forced myself to unlock the tower door and step out onto the gallery. The air was crisp, stinging my lungs with ozone and salt. From up here, the ocean looked benign, a vast, sparkling blanket, hiding the horrors of the night before. I walked the circumference of the walkway, looking for evidence. I checked the iron railings, the glass of the lantern room, the copper roof. Nothing. No slime trails, no scratch marks on the metal. It was as if the climber had been a phantom. But then I leaned over the railing, looking down the whitewashed shaft of the tower. There, just below the level of my bedroom window, I saw it. 3 deep parallel gouges in the brickwork. They were white scars against the weathered gray paint, cutting deep into the masonry. They looked like they had been made by a chisel or a claw harder than steel, and stuck in the rough texture of the brick near the gouges was a small clump of something dark and fibrous. I went back inside, locking the heavy iron door behind me with trembling fingers. I needed answers. The lighthouse had been automated years ago, but the Coast Guard still employed a keeper for maintenance and security. I was the first one stationed here in 6 months. The previous keeper, a man named Elias Thorne, had vanished. The official report said, swept out to sea during a storm, a tragic accident. I went down to the service room, a cluttered space filled with tools, spare bulbs, and cans of brass polish. In the corner sat an old wooden desk, scarred by decades of boredom and knife work. I opened the top drawer. Empty, save for a few dried up pens. I tried the bottom drawer. Stuck. I jiggled it, then yanked hard. It gave way with a screech of wood on wood. Inside, buried under a pile of rusted washers, was a leather-bound logbook. It wasn't the official Coast Guard log that was kept upstairs near the radio. This was a personal journal. I opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise cursive. Elias had been a meticulous man. The 1st of October arrived on station. The solitude is a blessing. The mainland was getting too loud. The light is in good condition, though the rotation mechanism needs greasing. The 4th of October, high seas today. The spray is hitting the gallery deck. Slept well. I flipped forward. The neat cursive began to deteriorate. The ink became blotchy. The letters slanted and jagged. The 22nd of October heard the scratching again. It's not rats. Rats don't breathe like drowning men. It's coming from the north face of the tower. Why the north face? That's the side facing the deep trench. The 2nd of November. I found the slime. It's translucent like jellyfish meat, but it burns the skin. I touched a smear on the railing and my fingers are blistering. It climbs every 3rd night like clockwork. What is it looking for? I turned the page. The entries became frantic scrolls, heavy with underlining. The 11th of November. It knows I'm here. It stopped outside the window. It tapped. 3 taps, tap, 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 mocking me, or inviting me. I looked out. I wish to God I hadn't looked out. It has eyes like the lens, too many facets. The 14th of November. The drowned king is hungry. The light. The light isn't a warning. I see it now. We aren't warning ships away from the rocks. We are keeping the door closed. The beam is a bar on a cage. If the light goes out, the door opens. The last entry was dated the 17th of November, the day he disappeared. It was just one line, written so hard the pen had torn through the paper. It is wet inside the tower. It came from the basement. I slammed the book shut. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight falling across the desk. Came from the basement, I whispered. The basement of Needlepoint Light was a storage area for old fuel tanks and chains. It was carved directly into the bedrock of the island. There were no windows down there. And only one door, the heavy oak door at the bottom of the spiral staircase. I looked at the floorboards beneath my feet. Below me, the spiral staircase twisted down into the dark. I had checked the basement when I arrived. It had been damp, filled with shadows and the smell of rot, but empty. I grabbed my flashlight and the heavy iron keyring from the hook on the wall. I had to check the basement before I could descend into the bowels of the tower. Duty called. The sun was beginning its slow arc toward the western horizon, and the light needed tending. The lantern room at the top of Needlepoint is a jewel of the lighthouse. It houses a first-order Fresnel lens, a massive beehive-shaped structure of brass and glass, standing 12 feet tall. It's a masterpiece of 19th century engineering. Hundreds of glass prisms cut to capture every photon of light, and focus it into a single, piercing beam visible for 20 miles. But Needlepoint's lens is different. Most Fresnel lenses are clear crystal. When you look at them, they fracture the world into rainbows. But the glass in this lens has a peculiar tint. In the daylight it looks almost smoky, like quartz that has been exposed to radiation. At night, when the light pushes through it, the beam isn't white. It's a pale, sickly violet white, a color that makes the ocean look like spilled ink. I climbed the final iron ladder into the lantern room. The heat up here was intense, the greenhouse effect trapping the sun's warmth. The smell was overpowering: hot brass, oil, and ozone. I approached the lens. It hummed, not the mechanical hum of the rotation gears, I hadn't turned them on yet. It was a vibrational hum coming from the glass itself. When I placed my hand on the brass frame, I could feel it buzzing against my palm, a low frequency that made my teeth ache. Maintaining this light wasn't like the others ID worked on. Usually you check the bulb, or in the old days, the oil wick, polish the brass, and grease the gears. Here there was a specific protocol, a ritual. I opened the maintenance locker. Inside sat a heavy lead-lined canister marked compound, a 7, and a specialized syringe. The logbook, the official one, stated that the bulb utilized a proprietary gas mixture that needed to be replenished weekly. I had done it twice now. It felt wrong every time. I put on thick rubber gloves. I unscrewed the cap of the canister. The liquid inside was thick and viscous, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent green light. It didn't smell like gas. It smelled like the ocean floor sulfur and decay. I drew the liquid into the syringe. I climbed the small ladder to the injection port at the base of the bulb assembly. As I inserted the needle, the hum of the lens increased in pitch. It sounded hungry. I pushed the plunger. The green sludge vanished into the mechanism. Instantly, the glass prisms flared. Even without the main power on, the lens began to glow. Shadows danced on the walls of the lantern room, shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. The shadow of the railing looked like twisting tentacles. The shadow of my own hand looked like a claw. I stepped back, stripping off the gloves. I felt a wave of dizziness, a sudden, hypnotic pull toward the glass. I wanted to press my face against it. I wanted to look into the prisms and see what was reflected in their depths. Elias' journal echoed in my mind. The beam is a bar on a cage. I looked out at the ocean. From this height, I could see the dark blue line of the trench to the north, the drop-off where the continental shelf plunged into the abyss. The water there was different. It was calmer, flatter. While whitecaps churned around the rest of the island, the water over the trench was smooth as oil. And as the lens began to glow brighter, feeding on the compound of 7, I saw the water in the trench ripple, not from the wind, from below. Something massive was moving down there, a shadow darker than the deep, shifting just beneath the surface. It was waiting for the sun to go down. It was waiting for the third night. I turned the rotation gear switch. The heavy clockwork mechanism clunked into life. The massive lens began to spin, whoosh, whoosh. A beam of pale violet light stabbed out into the gathering dusk. It didn't cast light on the water so much as it seemed to push the darkness away. Where the beam hit, the water boiled. I shuddered. Elias was right. This wasn't a warning beacon. It was a containment field, and I was the jailer. The tide was low. The jagged teeth of needlepoint were exposed. Black rock slick with algae, and bladderwrack stretching out into the surf. I had an hour before the sun dipped fully below the horizon, and I needed to verify the source of the scratching. I grabbed a heavy gaff hook, a long wooden pole with a steel hook at the end, usually used for landing large fish, and made my way down the spiral stairs. I bypassed the basement door for now. I needed to see the outside first. The wind had picked up, biting and cold. I buttoned my heavy wool coat and stepped out the main door at the base of the tower. The smell of low tide was overwhelming today. It wasn't just the brine of the sea. It was a rotting, organic stench, like a whale carcass left to bloat in the sun. I pulled my scarf up over my nose and made my way around the base of the lighthouse. I stopped at the north face. I looked up. 60 feet above, I could see the gallery deck where I had stood earlier. But down here at eye level, the evidence was even more disturbing. The granite foundation blocks were scarred. Deep white scratches ran vertically up the stone. They weren't random. They were patterned. Left claw, right claw. Pull, drag. Pull, the spacing was immense. Whatever had made these marks had a reach of at least 7 feet. I touched one of the grooves. The stone was pulverized. It would take a diamond drill or incredible force to do this to granite. I followed the trail of scratches down. They disappeared into the tidal zone, slipping under the waterline. But caught in a crevice near the base was something else. At first, I thought it was a piece of gray tarp or plastic trash washed up from a fishing boat. I used the gaff hook to snag it and pull it loose. It came away with a wet sucking sound. It wasn't plastic. I held it up to the dying light. It was a sheet of organic material, about 2 feet square. It was translucent, gray-green, and veined with dark capillaries. It looked like kelp, but when I pinched it between my gloved fingers, it felt warm. It was skin, molted skin. It had a texture like sandpaper on one side and slime on the other, and it was thick, tougher than leather. I dropped it on the rocks, revulsion coiling in my gut. "What the hell are you?" I whispered to the ocean. A wave crashed against the rocks, sending a spray of icy water over me. As the foam receded, I saw something else. Further out on the point, near the edge of the drop-off into the trench, something was wedged in a tidal pool. I picked my way across the slippery rocks, gripping the gaff hook tight. It was a boot, a black, rubber Wellington boot. I hooked it and fished it out of the pool. It was heavy, water drained out of the top. It looked old, bleached by salt and sun. I turned it over. On the heel, carved into the rubber, were initials, et Elias Thorne. The boot wasn't empty. I looked inside. Stuck in the bottom, wedged tight in the rubber toe, were bones. Small white bones. Not a foot, not a leg. Finger bones. And scratched into the inside of the rubber boot cuff, in frantic, jagged letters, was a message. "They don't swim, they walk." I dropped the boot. It hit the rock with a dull thud. The sun was touching the water now. Shadows were stretching long and black across the rocks. The lighthouse beam overhead swung around, whoosh casting its violet glow over me. I looked out at the trench, 50 yards out. The water broke. A hand gray, massive, and webbed rose from the depths. It grasped a spire of rock that was usually submerged. Then another hand. A head broke the surface. It was far away, silhouetted against the dying light, but I saw it. It was humanoid. But wrong. The shoulders were too broad. The head was sleek, domed, with no nose, just gills flaring on the neck. It pulled itself up onto the rock. It stood there, water cascading off its gray skin. It turned its head. It looked directly at the lighthouse, directly at me. Then it slipped back into the water without a splash. I turned and ran. I scrambled over the slick rocks, slipping, bruising my knees, not caring. I reached the heavy iron door of the tower and slammed it shut, throwing the bolts, spinning the wheel lock until my hands bled. I backed away into the darkness of the storage room, gasping for air. It was the third night, and they were coming. I bolted the door. Then I dragged a heavy shelving unit in front of it, ignoring the screech of metal on concrete. It wouldn't stop something that could carve granite. But it made me feel better. A placebo for the panicked mind. I sprinted up the spiral stairs, past my quarters, all the way to the watchroom, just below the lantern. This was the nerve center of the lighthouse, the place with the charts, the emergency flares, and the radio. I needed to call the mainland. I needed to tell them. What? That sea monsters were sieging the lighthouse. That I found the previous keeper's foot bones inside a boot. They'd send a medevac for a psychiatric hold. Not a rescue team, but maybe that was enough. If I sounded crazy enough, they'd come to get me, and getting off this rock was all that mattered. I sat at the radio desk. The equipment was old but reliable, a heavy gray box with dials and a handset that looked like a brick. I flipped the power switch. The amber lights flickered on. The speaker hissed with static. "Coast Guard Station Booth Bay. This is Needle Point Light. Do you copy, over?" Static white noise that sounded like crashing waves. "Mayday, mayday. This is Keeper Jack Vance at Needle Point. I have an emergency. Requesting immediate extraction, over." Silence. Then a burst of noise. Crozet click, click, click. It wasn't random static. It was rhythmic, wet. Sharp clicks, like crab claws snapping together underwater. Click, 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 click. I adjusted the squelch, trying to filter it out. Station booth bay, please respond. I have intruders on the island, hostiles. The clicking stopped. A low hum filled the speaker. It oscillated, rising and falling in pitch. Then a voice cut through the hum. Jack, my blood froze. I dropped the handset. It swung by its cord, banging against the metal desk. I knew that voice. It was soft, a little raspy, with a distinct Maine accent. Jack, honey, are you there? It was Sarah, my wife. Sarah had been dead for 3 years. Car accident. Icy road on Route 1. I had identified the body. I had buried her. I picked up the handset with trembling fingers. Who is this? I whispered. It's cold, Jack, the voice said. It sounded distant, filtered through water. The water is so cold, but the light burns. This isn't funny, I snarled, tears stinging my eyes. Who the hell is this? We miss you down here, Sarah's voice continued, ignoring me. Elias is here. He says hello. He says the door is opening. The voice changed. It glitched. The pitch dropped deeper, turning into a guttural growl that vibrated the speaker mesh. Open the door, Jack. I slammed the handset down, severing the connection. I ripped the cord out of the wall socket. The silence that followed was heavy. But then I heard it. The sound from outside Skerich. Thud, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the tower wall right outside the watchroom. I looked at the barometer on the wall. The needle was plummeting. The pressure was dropping fast. Outside, the wind began to howl. A nor'easter. A big one. The kind of storm that buries the coast in foam and fury. Nature was conspiring with them. The storm would mask their approach. It would drown out my screams. I looked at the radar screen. A massive green blob was swirling toward the point. But in the center of the storm, right over the trench, there was a dead spot. A perfect black circle where the radar picked up nothing. The eye of the storm. Or something else. I stood up, backing away from the radio. I was cut off. No radio, no boat could land in this weather. I was alone on the rock. And they were climbing. The storm hit an hour after sunset. It didn't roll in gradually. It slammed into needlepoint like a hammer blow. The wind shrieked around the gallery, rattling the iron shutters and making the entire tower vibrate. Rain lashed against the glass of the lantern room in horizontal sheets, sounding like gravel thrown by the handful. I was in the lantern room, the highest point I could retreat to. I had locked the heavy iron door to the watchroom below. I had wedged a chair under the handle. I sat on the metal grating of the floor, my back against the pedestal of the lens. Across my lap lay the station's emergency shotgun, a Remington 870, loaded with buckshot. It felt pitifully inadequate against something that could shred granite, but the weight of the steel and wood was grounding. The lens rotated above me. Whoosh, whoosh. Violet light swept the room every 5 seconds, casting long, swinging shadows that made the equipment look like it was alive. I checked my watch. 2 a.m. The scratching started. Even over the roar of the gale, I heard it. It was louder this time. Boulder, scritch, thud. It wasn't just one set of sounds anymore. Scritch, thud. North face. Scritch, thud. West face. There were 2 of them. They were moving fast, unbothered by the wind that would have blown a human off the ladder. They were climbing synchronously, a rhythmic assault on the tower. I stood up, racking the slide of the shotgun. I moved to the center of the room, keeping the lens between me and the glass walls. The lantern room is a fishbowl. If they reached the gallery deck outside, they could see right in, and I could see right out. I watched the railing outside. The violet beam swept past, empty. The beam swept past again. Empty scritch. The sound stopped. They were at the top. They were on the gallery deck. I held my breath. The storm raged, rain pounding the glass. The beam swept past. A hand slapped against the glass. It was gray, slick with mucus and enormous. The fingers were long, multi-jointed, ending in black claws that hooked into the frame of the window. Webs of translucent skin stretched between the digits. I raised the shotgun. The beam swept past again, a face pressed against the glass. It was the face I had seen on the rocks, but up close. The horror was magnified. The eyes were huge, black orbs with no eyelids, reflecting the violet light with an iridescent sheen. The mouth was a circular maw filled with rows of needle, like teeth that rotated slowly. It didn't look angry, it looked curious. It tapped on the glass with a claw. Tap, tap. The same rhythm Elias had described. Then, the second one appeared on the opposite side of the room. It was smaller, leaner, its skin a mottled green. It pressed its face against the glass, its gills flaring wide, exposing red, raw flesh inside. They were studying me, like I was a specimen in a jar. The big one opened its mouth. It didn't roar. It didn't hiss. It spoke. The sound came through the glass, muffled, but audible. Vibrating in my chest, it sounded like grinding stones. Jack. It knew my name. The light burns. I aimed the shotgun at the big one's face. Get down, I screamed, though I knew it was pointless. Get off the tower. The creature tilted its head. It blinked, a nictitating membrane sliding sideways across its black eyes. Not a warning, it gurgled. A key. It raised a fist and slammed it against the reinforced glass. Boom! A spiderweb fracture appeared in the pane. Turn it off. I fired. The boom of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. The buckshot hit the glass right where the creature's face had been. The reinforced glass held, but the impact starred the pane, turning it opaque. The creature recoiled, disappearing into the darkness of the storm. I spun around, aiming at the second one. It was gone, but the scratching hadn't stopped. It had moved. It was coming from above. They were on the copper roof. I looked up at the vent at the very top of the lantern room. It was small, maybe a foot wide, covered by a metal cap. I heard the cap being wrenched off. Metal screeched. A long gray arm reached down through the hole, groping blindly toward the lens. They weren't trying to get in to kill me. They were trying to break the light. The arm dangled from the roof vent like a bloated gray python, its claws snapping inches above the delicate prisms of the Fresnel lens. Slime dripped from the limb, sizzling as it hit the hot glass. I didn't hesitate. I pumped the shotgun and fired straight up. The blast tore through the vent hole. The arm jerked back with a wet shriek that sounded more like bending metal than an animal cry. Dark black ichor sprayed down, spattering the floor and the brass housing of the light. Get back, I yelled, my voice raw. For a moment there was silence, save for the howling wind and the rhythmic whoosh of the turning lens. Then, the whispering started. It didn't come from the roof. It didn't come from the shattered pane. It seemed to come from the glass itself, vibrating through the room like the hum of a high-tension wire. Jack. It wasn't Sarah's voice this time. It was a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, weaving together into a discordant harmony. Some were deep and gravelly, others high and piping. The ocean is deep, Jack. So much room, so much silence. I backed away, pressing myself against the iron door of the lantern room. I kept the shotgun trained on the ceiling, but my eyes darted around the glass walls. Shadows moved on the gallery deck outside. They were circling. Round and round, I could hear their wet footsteps slapping on the iron grating. Slap squelch, slap squelch. Why do you fight the tide? The voices whispered. Elias didn't fight. He walked into the water. He breathes the dark now. He sees the sunken cities. Elias is dead, I shouted. I found his foot in a boot. A low gurgling laughter filled the room. A shed shell. A cocoon. He is more now. He is waiting for you. The voices shifted, becoming seductive, almost kind. We can give you things, Jack. We know where the gold chips lie. We know the songs of the whales before they had lungs. We know where Sarah is. My grip on the shotgun faltered. The mention of Sarah hit me like a physical blow. She's cold, Jack. She's waiting in the dark. But if you turn off the light, the water warms. If the drowned king wakes, you can bring her back. I looked at the lens. The violet beam cut through the storm, illuminating the driving rain. It was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It was the only thing keeping the drowned king. Whatever that titan was asleep, but the pull was strong. The idea of Sarah, not dead, not gone, but waiting. I took a step toward the rotation mechanism. My hand hovered over the kill switch. If I stopped it, the whispering would stop. The scratching would stop. Do it, the voices urged. Break the seal. I looked at the black ichor dripping from the ceiling. It was smoking, eating into the brass floor. It wasn't a gift. It was the infection. No, I whispered. I grabbed the handle of the manual rotation, cranked the backup system in case the motor failed. You want the light off, I yelled at the unseen choir. Then come and turn it off yourselves. I didn't turn it off. I turned it up. I cranked the speed. The lens spun faster. Whoosh whoosh. The beam became a strobe. The violet light flashed rapidly, creating a disorienting, psychedelic effect in the storm. The creatures outside screamed. It was a sound of pain. The faster strobing light seemed to hurt them, to burn them. The footsteps on the gallery scrambled. I heard bodies hitting the railing, then the dull thud splash of heavy weights falling into the ocean below. They retreated. The whispering faded into a hiss of static and then silence. I slumped to the floor, my back against the door. I was shaking uncontrollably. I had won the round. But as I looked at the cracked glass and the black slime, I knew the war was far from over. They had tried force. They had tried manipulation. Next time, they wouldn't play games. And I realized with a sinking dread that while I was watching the roof and the windows, I hadn't checked the basement door since I came up here. Elias' last entry flashed in my mind. It came from the basement. I stayed in the lantern room until dawn broke. The storm raged itself out overnight, leaving behind a gray, choppy sea and a sky the color of a bruised plum. When the sun was fully up, I finally unlocked the door to the watchroom and began my descent. I moved slowly, shotgun leveled at every shadow, every curve of the spiral staircase. The tower was silent, save for the echo of my own boots on the iron steps. I reached my quarters. The door was still locked, just as I had left it. I checked inside, nothing had been disturbed. I continued down, past the oil room, past the spare parts storage. I reached the ground floor. The heavy steel door leading outside was bolted. The barricade I had built the shelving unit was still in place, though it had shifted slightly, scraping grooves into the concrete floor. Something had pushed against the door from the outside, but the lock had held. I turned toward the basement door. It was a heavy oak door, banded with iron straps, set into a stone archway under the curve of the staircase. It led down into the bedrock foundation of the island, to the old cisterns and fuel storage. It was closed, but it wasn't how I left it. I had left it unlocked, but shut tight, now. It was slightly ajar. Just a crack, maybe an inch, and leaking out from under that inch-wide gap was water. A dark, stagnant puddle had formed on the concrete floor. It didn't look like rainwater or groundwater. It was thick, oily, and smelled of low tide and rotting fish. I stepped closer, my boots splashing in the puddle. I aimed the flashlight at the floor. There were footprints. They were wet, large, and misshapen. They led out of the basement door, tracked across the concrete floor, and stopped at the base of the spiral stairs. They didn't go up. They stopped, pivoted, and went back down into the basement. Something had come up during the night. It had stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to me, maybe debating whether to climb, and then it had returned to the dark. I swallowed hard, the taste of bile in my throat. I kicked the shelving unit away from the main door. I needed fresh air. I needed to think. But I couldn't leave that door unchecked. I walked to the basement door. I put my hand on the iron ring handle. It was cold and slick with slime. I pulled. The hinges screamed in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into absolute blackness. The smell rolled up to meet me. It was the same smell as the creature's breath, ozone, decay, and ancient stagnant water. I shined the flashlight down. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating damp stone walls covered in green moss. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor was flooded. Black water, maybe a foot deep, covered the storage area, and floating in the water were shapes, old fuel barrels, broken crates, and something else. In the corner, half submerged, was a hole in the wall. It wasn't a man-made opening. The brickwork had been smashed inward, revealing the jagged granite of the island's core. And beyond the granite, a dark tunnel led downward. It was a sea cave, a fissure in the rock that connected the basement to the ocean. As I watched, the water in the basement rippled. A surge came from the tunnel, raising the water level by a few inches. The tide was coming in, and with the tide, the tunnel was open. I saw movement in the tunnel. A pale gray hand gripped the edge of the jagged rock, then another. They weren't climbing the tower from the outside anymore. They didn't need to. They had a back door. I slammed the oak door shut. I threw the bolt. It slid home with a reassuring clump. But oak wouldn't hold them. Not for long. I looked around the ground floor. I needed metal. I needed a welder. I remembered the maintenance shed outside. There was an arc welder there, and steel plates. I had until nightfall. Night 9 was coming. The third cycle, and this time, they wouldn't be tapping on the glass. They would be coming up the stairs. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, fueled by adrenaline and terror. The lighthouse wasn't just a building anymore. It was a fortress, and the siege was about to begin. I dragged the portable arc welder from the maintenance shed, the heavy cables trailing behind me like snakes. I found 3 sheets of 1/4-inch steel plating leftovers from a hull repair on the old supply boat, and hauled them inside. My muscles screaming in protest. I worked with a manic focus. I positioned the steel plates over the oak basement door, overlapping them to cover the frame and the hinges. I fired up the welder. Zuds crack. Blue sparks showered the dim entryway, smelling of ozone and melting metal. I welded the plates directly to the iron doorframe. I welded the bolts shut. I welded the handle off. By the time I was done, the basement door wasn't a door anymore. It was a solid wall of steel. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. If they could carve granite, they could cut steel. It would just buy me time. Next, I turned my attention to the spiral staircase. The stairs were cast iron, winding up a central pillar. If they broke through the basement door, this was the only way up. I raided the storage room. Old furniture, crates of spare parts, heavy coils of rope. I dragged everything to the bottom of the stairs. I wedged a massive oak desk between the central pillar and the outer wall, effectively blocking the first flight. I piled chairs, fuel cans, and bags of cement mix on top of it. It looked like a chaotic junk pile, but it was dense. I retreated up to the next level of the oil room and did it again. I tipped over the heavy oil drums, rolling them down the stairs to create a second barrier. By late afternoon, the tower was a vertical obstacle course. I was exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, my hands trembling. I climbed back up to the lantern room. As the sun began to set, the sky was clear tonight, a bad sign. The storm had masked their approach before. Tonight the silence would be my enemy. I would hear them coming from a mile away. I stepped out onto the gallery deck for one last look. The ocean was calm, too calm. The water over the trench to the north was flat as a mirror, reflecting the dying orange light of the sun. But as I watched, the water broke. Not one shape this time, not 2, dozens. They surfaced silently, black silhouettes against the orange water. They didn't splash. They just rose like islands emerging from the deep. Some were humanoid like the ones I had seen before. Others were wrong, massive, hulking shapes with too many limbs. Some looked like crabs the size of cars. Others looked like tangled masses of kelp that moved against the current. They were gathering at the base of the island, an army. I saw the water around the rocks begin to churn. They were climbing out of the surf. I looked down at the base of the tower. I couldn't see the basement entrance, it was underground, but I could imagine them swarming into the sea cave, filling the tunnel, pressing against the steel plates I had just welded. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the gathering horde, rising from the deepest part of the trench, was a massive shape. It barely broke the surface, just a ridge of spined back, like a mountain range emerging from the sea. It was immense. If that was just the back, the creature itself must have been the size of a submarine. It let out a sound, a low resonant thrum that vibrated the air and shook the lighthouse foundation. It was the drowned king, or at least his herald. The vibration traveled up the tower. I felt it in my boots. I felt it in the glass of the lantern room. The lens began to hum in response. I went inside and locked the iron door to the gallery. I checked the shotgun. 5 rounds in the tube, 1 in the chamber. A box of 25 on the floor. I checked the lens. The compound to 7 level was low. I injected the last canister. The green light flared, hungry and bright. I turned the rotation gear. Whoosh, whoosh. The violet beam swept out. As it hit the water, the shapes recoiled. They hated the light, but there were too many of them, and the night was long. I sat with my back against the lens pedestal, the shotgun across my knees. I waited for the scratching. The sun vanished, and with it the last shred of my hope. The lighthouse was a beacon of violet defiance in a world of absolute black. The beam swept the darkness, whoosh. Whoosh, illuminating slices of rain-slicked rock and churning water. At 9 p.m. the first sound came. It wasn't a scratch. It was a clang. Deep, resonant, and from below. Clang, it sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a submarine hull. It was coming from the basement door. My welds were holding, but something down there was hitting the steel with incredible force. Clang. The tower vibrated. Dust drifted down from the ceiling of the lantern room. Then, the scratching started on the outside. Scratch. Thud. Scratch. Thud. It wasn't rhythmic this time. It was chaotic. A cacophony of scraping. I stood up and looked out the glass. The beam swept the tower. They were everywhere. Dozens of the gray. Humanoid things were scaling the masonry like geckos. They covered the white brick, a writhing carpet of slick, gray skin. Their claws found purchase in the mortar, pulling their heavy bodies up inch by inch. But they weren't just climbing. They were digging. I saw chunks of brick falling away. They were tearing at the mortar, trying to destabilize the tower. They wanted to bring it down. I aimed the shotgun through the glass, and fired at a cluster of them near the railing. Boom. The glass starred but held. The buckshot couldn't penetrate the reinforced pane, but the shockwave knocked 2 of them loose. They fell silently into the dark. 3 more took their place instantly. Clang. The sound from the basement was louder now, accompanied by the screech of tearing metal. They were through the first plate. I backed away from the window, realizing my mistake. I was focused on the climbers, but the real threat was below. I ran to the internal door of the lantern room, looking down the spiral staircase shaft. The barricade at the bottom of the desk, the cement bags, was moving. It wasn't being pushed. It was heaving. Something massive was underneath it, lifting the entire pile of furniture with terrifying ease. I saw a long black limb thick as a tree trunk, covered in barbed snake through the gap in the debris. It wrapped around the cast iron railing of the stairs and squeezed. The metal shrieked and bent like warm taffy. The limb pulled. With a crash that shook the fillings in my teeth, the barricade collapsed. The desk splintered. The cement bags burst, sending a cloud of gray dust up the shaft. Through the dust, they poured in. Not just the humanoids, the other things. Crab-like horrors scuttled over the debris, their claws clicking. Eel things slithered up the railings. They began to ascend the spiral. I slammed the lantern room trapdoor shut. It was a heavy iron hatch in the floor. I spun the wheel lock. I was trapped at the top. Scritch. I looked up. They were on the roof again. The copper dome groaned under the weight. The vent cap was gone. This time, they weren't reaching in with arms. A face appeared in the hole. It wasn't a monster face. It was a human face. It was Elias, or what was left of him. His skin was bloated and pale, peeling away in strips. His eyes were gone, replaced by glowing green barnacles. His mouth hung open, jaw unhinged. He looked down at me through the hole in the roof. He opened his mouth. "Jack," he gurgled. The voice was wet, filled with sludge. "The king is awake." He vomited a stream of black bile onto the lens below. The liquid hit the hot glass. Hiss. The glass cracked. Not a small spiderweb crack. A massive structural fracture ran down the center of the main prism. The hum of the lens changed. It went from a hungry buzz to a high-pitched scream. The rotation gear grinded. Sparks flew from the motor housing. Clunk. The lens stopped turning. The beam froze. It was no longer sweeping the ocean. It was fixed on a single point in the north directly over the trench. Directly over the massive shape I had seen surfacing, the water where the beam hit began to boil violently. And then, slowly, agonizingly, a giant eye opened in the water. It was the size of a house. It was yellow, slit-pupiled, and ancient. It looked up at the light, and then it blinked. The blinking of that colossal eye sent a shock wave through the very bedrock of the island. It wasn't a physical wave, it was psychic. I felt it in the base of my skull, a sudden, crushing pressure like diving too deep without equalizing. My nose started to bleed, warm drops splattering onto the brass floor grating. The light was fixed. The rotation mechanism was jammed, smoke pouring from the motor housing. The beam drilled into the water, illuminating the horror beneath the surface. The drowned king was rising. I could see more of it now. The eye was just one small part of a face that defied geometry. Scales the size of shields glistened in the violet light. Tentacles, thick as redwood trees, churned the water into a frothy maelstrom. It was rising toward the light, drawn to it like a moth to a flame, or a prisoner to the opening of a cell door. The lens screamed. The fracture Elias had caused was spreading. The glass was vibrating so violently, I thought it would shatter into dust. The violet light was fluctuating, pulsing erratically. Wub, wub, wub. Each pulse coincided with a surge from the creature below. The monsters on the tower froze. The scratching stopped. The climbing stopped. Even the banging on the trapdoor beneath my feet ceased. They were waiting. They were watching their god ascend. I scrambled to the manual crank. If I could get the lens moving again, maybe I could disperse the beam, weaken the connection. I grabbed the iron handle. It was hot to the touch. I pulled. It didn't budge. The gears were fused. Come on, I screamed, putting my shoulder into it. Crack. The handle snapped off in my hand. I flew backward, hitting the glass wall of the lantern room. I looked up at the roof vent. Elias' face was still there, peering down. He was smiling now, a rictus grin that split his bloated face ear to ear. Too late, Jack. The thing that was Elias gurgled. The anchor is lifted. He reached down. Not with a hand, but with a long barbed tongue. It lashed out, wrapping around the brass frame of the lens. He pulled. The lens tilted. The beam shifted. It swept across the water, cutting a swath through the army of monsters on the rocks below. Where the light touched them, they didn't just burn, they evaporated. They turned into mist and ash instantly, but Elias didn't care. He was trying to aim the light at the tower. If he could focus that intense, concentrated energy on the lantern room itself, he could melt the glass, destroy the housing, and extinguish the flame. I scrambled for the shotgun. It was on the floor near the trapdoor. I grabbed it just as the trapdoor buckled. Boom! Something hit it from below with tremendous force. The iron plate deformed upward. Boom! A claw punched through the metal. It was black, metallic, and dripping with oil. They were breaking through the floor. I was trapped between the monsters below and the traitor above, and outside, a titan was surfacing. I looked at the canister of Compound 7. It was empty. The syringe lay on the floor. But there was another locker, the emergency locker. I crawled toward it, dodging dripping bile from Elias and the debris falling from the ceiling. Inside the locker was a flare gun, and a box of old school, magnesium flares, and a single red canister. It wasn't marked Compound 7. It had no label at all, just a skull and crossbones painted in white. Elias' journal hadn't mentioned this, but I remembered a rumor, a story told by an old salt in a bar in Portland. He said the old keepers had a fail-safe, a way to scrub the glass. I grabbed the red canister. It was heavy. I looked at the injection port on the lens. Elias saw what I was doing. His tongue lashed out, trying to grab my arm. I rolled, dodging the strike. I racked the shotgun one-handed and fired blindly at the roof. The shot went wide, but it startled him enough to retract the tongue. I slammed the red canister onto the injection port. I twisted the valve. There was no syringe needed. It was pressurized. Hiss. A liquid darker than blood flooded into the lens mechanism. The violet light died instantly. The room plunged into darkness. For a second, there was silence. And then, the lens ignited, not with violet light, with fire. The fire wasn't orange. It wasn't red. It was a blinding, pure white incandescence that seared the retinas. It didn't cast shadows. It obliterated them. The heat was instantaneous. The air in the lantern room went from humid to scorching in a heartbeat. The paint on the walls bubbled and peeled. My eyebrows singed. The lens roared. The compound, whatever was in that red canister, wasn't a fuel. It was an accelerant designed to overload the system. Above me, Elias screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of boiling liquid and popping meat. The white light blasted upward through the vent hole, catching him full in the face. His bloated head exploded. Chunks of cooked flesh and barnacles rained down onto the gallery deck outside. The tongue, severed and twitching, fell onto the floor beside me. Smoking, the army of monsters on the tower froze again. But this time, it wasn't in reverence. It was in terror. The white light spilled out of the lantern room, flooding the ocean. Where the beam hit the water, it didn't just boil, it vaporized. A massive cloud of steam rose instantly, obscuring the drowned king. I heard a sound from the deep roar of frustration and pain that shook the tower to its foundations. The Titan was retreating. The light was too pure, too hot. It couldn't look at it, but the danger inside wasn't over. The trapdoor beneath me gave way with a final, screeching tear of metal. The iron plate flew off its hinges. Clattering against the wall, through the hole he rose. It wasn't a monster. It was a man, or it had been. He wore the tattered, rot-stained uniform of a 19th century lighthouse keeper. Brass buttons, turned green with verdigris, clung to a coat that was more mold than wool. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over bone, gray and leathery, like the skin I had found on the rocks. But his eyes were the worst part. They were Fresnel lenses. Actual glass prisms were embedded in his sockets, glowing with a faint, dying violet light. He pulled himself up through the floor, his movements jerky and mechanical. He held a rusted gaff hook in one hand. "Jack," he rasped. His voice sounded like wind blowing through dry reeds. I scrambled back, raising the shotgun. "Stay back." The keeper tilted his head. The prisms in his eyes rotated, focusing on me. "You burn the candle at both ends," he said. "A waste." He stepped toward the blazing lens. The heat didn't seem to bother him. His uniform smoked, but his skin didn't blister. "Who are you?" I yelled over the roar of the fire. "I am the first," he said. "I lit the first flame. I dug the first grave." He reached out a hand toward the lens. He wasn't trying to destroy it. He was trying to touch it, to absorb it. "The king sleeps," the first keeper said, "but he dreams, and his dreams leak through." He pointed the gaff hook at me. "You think this is a prison?" He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "No, boy, it is a feeding trough. We keep him asleep by feeding him the light." He gestured to the white fire. "And now you have burned the meal." He lunged. I fired the shotgun. The buckshot hit him in the chest. It didn't stop him. It just puffed dust and mold from his coat. He didn't bleed. He didn't even stumble. He swung the gaff hook. The steel tip caught my shoulder, tearing through my heavy coat and biting into the flesh. I screamed, dropping the gun. I fell backward, sliding on the slick floor. The first keeper stood over me, raising the hook for a killing blow. "A new wick is needed," he intoned. "You will burn brightly." I looked around for a weapon. My hand brushed against the severed tongue of Elias. It was still hot. I grabbed it. It was sticky and heavy. As the gaff hook came down, I swung the tongue like a whip. It wrapped around the first keeper's neck. The barbs dug in. He stumbled, clawing at his throat. I scrambled to my feet. I saw the flare gun in the open locker. I dived for it. The first keeper ripped the tongue free, tearing his own throat open. No blood flow, just dust. He turned to me, his prism eyes spinning wildly. I raised the flare gun. I didn't aim at him. I aimed at the red canister still attached to the lens. "Eat this," I whispered. I pulled the trigger. The flare hit the red canister with a dull thwack. For a microsecond, nothing happened. The magnesium slug burned furiously against the painted metal, a brilliant white star in the center of the room. Then, the pressure inside the canister reached critical mass. Boom! The explosion wasn't a fireball. It was a shockwave of pure thermal energy. The canister disintegrated. The remaining accelerant vaporized instantly, creating an expanding sphere of superheated gas. The blast threw me backward. I hit the iron door of the lantern room hard enough to knock the wind out of me. My vision went white. When my sight returned, seconds later, the world was on fire. The lens was gone. The beautiful, $1,000,000 assembly of brass and glass had been obliterated. Shards of molten crystal were embedded in the walls, glowing like embers. The floor was a lake of burning fluid. The first keeper was screaming. He was standing in the center of the inferno. The blast had stripped the moldy coat from his body, revealing a ribcage that was more coral than bone. The prisms in his eyes had shattered. He flailed blindly, the gaff hook melting in his hand. "The door," he shrieked. "You opened the door." He collapsed into the burning sludge, his body dissolving into ash and steam. But the fire wasn't contained. It was eating the tower. The paint on the walls was blistering. The iron floor grating was sagging, and outside was silence. The violet beam was gone. The white glare was gone. The darkness had returned. I crawled toward the door. The heat was unbearable. My coat was smoldering. I pushed the door open and stumbled out onto the gallery deck. The cool air hit me like a blessing. Rain sizzled on my skin. I looked over the railing. The ocean was pitch black. No moon, no stars. Just the void, but down in the water, something was glowing. Deep in the trench, a faint bioluminescent green light was pulsing. Thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the drowned king. He wasn't retreating anymore, he was waking up. Without the suppression of the light, he was free to rise. I looked back at the burning lantern room. I had destroyed the jailer, but I had also destroyed the cell. I had to leave now. I scrambled down the ladder to the watchroom. It was filled with smoke. I grabbed the emergency radio handset, miraculously spared from the surge. "Mayday! Mayday!" I screamed, coughing. "Needlepoint light is down. Major fire. Requesting immediate evac." Static, then. A voice. "Not Sarah. Not a monster. Needlepoint. This is Coast Guard Cutter Adderley. We see the fire. We are 5 miles out. Hang tight. Son, we're coming. Real people, a real boat." I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor. But as I sat there, listening to the roar of the fire above and the thump-thump from the deep below, I realized something. The fire wouldn't last forever. The fuel would burn out. The tower would cool, and then the darkness would be absolute. The drowned king would rise. He would come for the mainland. He would come for the cities. Unless... I looked at the open locker in the watchroom. Inside, there was a crate. It was heavy, marked with the same skull and crossbones as the red canister. Fail-safe charges. They weren't just accelerants. They were demolition charges, designed to drop the tower, to collapse the lighthouse into the sea cave below, to seal the breach with 10,000 tons of granite and iron. I looked out the window. I could see the lights of the Coast Guard cutter in the distance. Salvation. I looked at the crate. If I left, the king would rise. If I stayed, I grabbed the crate. I dragged it to the center of the room, right over the spiral staircase shaft. I opened it. Wired blocks of C4 sat inside, connected to a timer. I set the timer, 5 o'clock. 5 minutes. The Coast Guard was 5 miles out. They wouldn't make it in time to stop me. But they would be close enough to pick me up. If I jumped, I looked at the drop. 100 feet to the churning water. I looked at the timer. 4:45. I stood up. I buttoned my coat. I walked out to the gallery deck. The green glow in the water was brighter now. A massive tentacle broke the surface, slapping the rocks below. "Not today," I whispered. I climbed over the railing, and I jumped. The fall lasted forever. I fell through the darkness, the wind tearing at my clothes. I saw the green glow of the water rushing up to meet me. I saw the massive tentacle writhing near the base of the tower. I hit the water. It was like hitting concrete. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. The cold was a physical shock, seizing my muscles instantly. I plunged deep, the momentum carrying me down into the black. I spun in the turbulence, fighting to find which way was up. Then the shockwave hit. Boom. The charges detonated. Even underwater, the sound was deafening. It felt like a giant hand squeezing my entire body. I looked up through the churning foam. I saw the lighthouse, the mighty needlepoint light crumble. The masonry shattered. The iron tower buckled. The entire structure collapsed inward, falling straight down into the foundation. It crashed into the sea cave, tons of rock and steel sealing the entrance to the deep. The impact sent a massive wave outward. It caught me, tumbling me like a rag doll, pushing me away from the island. I surfaced, gasping for air, choking on salt water and dust. The lighthouse was gone. Only a jagged stump of foundation remained, shrouded in a cloud of dust and steam. The green glow in the trench flickered, and died. The king was buried. I treaded water, my limbs growing heavy. The cold was seeping into my core. My vision was tunneling. Over here I see him. A spotlight swept across the water. The Coast Guard cutter. They fished me out. They wrapped me in blankets. They asked me what happened. I told them it was a gas explosion. I told them the old system malfunctioned. I told them I was the only survivor. They believed me. Why wouldn't they? Who would believe the truth? I spent a month in the hospital. Hypothermia, broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder. They said I was lucky to be alive. They retired needlepoint light. They said it was too expensive to rebuild. They put a solar-powered buoy out near the rocks instead. I retired too. Disability pension. I moved inland. Ohio as far from the ocean as I could get, but I didn't escape. Every night I dream of the water. I dream of the violet light, and every third night. I wake up to a sound, scritch, thud. It's not coming from outside my window. I live in a second-floor apartment in a brick building. There are no cliffs here, no sea caves. But the sound is there, faint, persistent. I get up. I check the window. Nothing. I check the door. Nothing. Then I look in the mirror, my eyes. They look normal to everyone else. But when I look close, really close, I can see it. Deep in the pupil, there is a faint, violet glow. And sometimes, when I blink, I hear a mechanical whir. The first keeper said a new wick was needed. He said I would burn brightly. I destroyed the tower. I destroyed the lens. But the energy, the containment field, it didn't just disappear. It had to go somewhere. It went into me. I am the lighthouse now. I sit in my living room, in the dark, every third night. I stare at the wall. I focus. I feel the hum in my bones. I feel the heat in my chest. And I push the darkness back. I don't know how long I can keep it up. I don't know how long before the drowned king realizes that his prison isn't made of stone anymore, but of flesh and blood. But until then, I keep the watch, Skirich. There it is again. It's getting louder. It knows where I am.